Hey, I'm really excited today to welcome Jack Lawrence to our program. Jack was born and raised in Indianapolis, and he worked as a family therapist. He began his career at an addiction treatment facility and then went into private practice. After retiring from the therapy field, he dove into his second career and his childhood dream of writing. Thorn is his first novel and part of a series. And Jack, do you have 5 titles now?
Yeah, so right now there's 3 in the David Thorn series and then 2 thrillers that are standalones.
So 5 in total, and they are thrillers.
Yep. So the David Thorn series is more crime fiction mystery, and then the thrillers are crime thrillers.
That's what we love around here. We have some dark humor going on around here. Jack still lives in Minneapolis with his wife, and they enjoy spending time with their children and their dogs. He also enjoys using his free time to sit by the water and fish. Good place to think up some more story stuff. He and his wife enjoy traveling and using their secondhand camper at new campgrounds. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you. Thank you. It's definitely an honor to be able to speak here today.
Take it away. Thank you so much.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I was a family therapist. So that essentially means I was a systemic therapist. Everything I did was in the context and the lens of systems, which is considerably different from mental health counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers. They work more in the realm of pathology, right? So for them, if there's depression, for example, it's something going on in the brain. There's some sort of chemical imbalance or something like that. Whereas for a systemic therapist, it's more what is going on in your life, what is your lived experience, your family history. So we look at the kind of broader context of the human experience versus maybe just the symptom of what's going on. And we always refer to that as the biopsychosocial lens, where you look at somebody's biology, their psychology, and the social factors, right? So biology would be any hereditary stuff, anything going on that's genetic. Psycho would be that anxiety, depression, PTSD, any type of psychological diagnosis that might be there. And then social, that's their settings and their surroundings, right? So somebody who's, for example, struggling with addiction, what that might look like in a biopsychosocial lens is, okay, did your family have a history of drinking? And then psychology, maybe they were in the military, so there's some PTSD there. Maybe they're going through a divorce, just lost a job. And then the social, again, if they were in the military or in college, right, these are settings where drinking is encouraged. So it's something that is going to play a role in that versus there's a chemical imbalance in the brain, and that's what we need to fix, right? So we look at the bigger picture. And I think when it comes to creating characters in a story or driving a plot, that kind of broader context, it delivers a little bit more, right? Because nobody does anything on accident. Nobody does anything just because. Everything we do has a motivation behind it, whether we recognize it or not. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more, those unknown or those subconscious things that drive us that we aren't always necessarily aware of, like our different struggles and things like that. Excuse me. I'm curious, has anybody ever seen the movie The Rock? It's got Nicolas Cage and Sean Connery in it? Okay. So that's one that I really like to point out as something where you could use like the systems perspective to break down the characters and kind of everything that's going on in the film that motivates the people involved and everything like that, beyond just there's a good guy, there's a bad guy, things like that. General Hummel, for example, he's obviously the bad guy. He steals chemical weapons. And anybody who hasn't seen it, there's going to be a lot of spoilers, so I apologize. So he steals the chemical weapons. He tells the government he's going to launch it over San Francisco and it's going to kill hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, unless the government gives him money. So you kind of hear that and you think, okay, he's obviously motivated by money. He's just a violent guy who wants to wreak havoc and cause damage and do as much as he can. And then you have the character John Patrick, who's played by Sean Connery. He's also the villain, but he's been locked away in prison. He's very old, less threatening, but they bring in this bad guy to fight the bad guy alongside Nicolas Cage, who's an FBI agent, because he knows Alcatraz. So his upbringing in his life was living in the jail system, at least the later part of his life. And so they're using that to help the better good, right? You have a bad guy who can be used to help save the world, basically. Even though he's a villain, he spent most of his life in prison. He's not allowed contact with anybody because he's so terrible, but he has something to offer that can help. Whereas Hummel, he's been in the Army or the Marines, he's had several tours. In theory, he should be the good guy, but for some reason, he's turned bad. And so these roles are almost swapped, right? Where the obvious bad guy, the guy who spent all his time in jail, is being used to help bring this person who's fought for the country, who has turned bad, to justice. But you look at Hummel and his experience, and you realize that it's not as clear cut as all of that, right? So he, at the very beginning of the movie, he's lost his wife. So now he's obviously got very little to live for. That was his purpose in life, was the military and his wife. And so he's lost his wife. His men that he's lost, his family, their families aren't receiving any funds or being taken care of. And so his whole motivation really is to help protect them, to do something for his men one last time. And so you start to get attached to this character, and you look at him and you realize maybe he's not really a bad guy. Maybe there's some humanity in him, right? And then towards the end of the movie, he knows the government calls him on his bluff, and he tries to walk away. Like, he knows, I've tried, it's not going to work. I'm not really this evil person, and I'm not really capable of doing these things. And so you look at the kind of the exterior motivation, and that's kind of what I'm talking about, right? Where you see this person who's ready to cause havoc. He's asking for all of this money, and on the exterior, you see him as a greedy person who just wants this big payday so that he can walk away. But there's a whole lot more than that, right? The only way he knows how to resolve conflict is through violence, because his whole life has been spent as a Marine. And he knows how to work the government. He knows how to work the system. And so his ultimate goal is to help the people that served under him. So the obvious motivation isn't always what's really driving somebody. A lot of times it's something that's underneath that you start peeling back layers, right? And you find that there's a whole lot more there. And so, like, when I was working with people who maybe struggled with addiction or depression, or if I was working with couples and they would tell me the biggest issue they had was communication, you have to look beyond that first layer, because communication is a lot of things. And we're always communicating 100% of the time with body language, eye contact, breathing, our actions. So their communication is there. It's just trying to find where that break is, right? And so nobody lives in complete isolation. And I think that's what matters the most when you're talking about characters and plots and their motivation in the story, is that no character is completely isolated. They're all shaped by family roles. They always typically maintain relationship patterns. And what I mean by that is, for example, pursuer, distancer, right? In most relationships, one person is constantly pursuing and one person is constantly distancing, one way or another. Those roles can flip-flop. What that distance looks like is going to change, but it's always there in some form or fashion. And when it's not, it causes conflict, because now things feel very abnormal. They feel out of balance. And what our ultimate goal is to find that balance no matter what. So we'll do things to replicate that, to feel like we're back in some sort of balance, right? Whether that's creating a situation where one person has to pursue or distance. Sorry, I think the allergies are kicking up here. So yeah, we always do things to replicate our patterns. So then when you look at like systemic influences, it's going to create a more complex and deeper narrative, not just for the story, but for the characters overall. But I think the important thing that I've heard a lot of people talk about in good cinema or good stories in general is that blurring between good and bad. And it's great to have a good guy that's very clearly a good guy and a bad guy who's very clearly a bad guy. But nobody truly lives their life like that. Everybody, even villains, even the most evil people in the world, do something because they feel it's the right thing to do. That motivation might be very misguided, very selfish in nature, but to them, it's the right thing to do. So these villains don't act just because they're evil or just because they want money or just because they want retribution and want people to pay. There's a reason for that. So going back to The Rock, the reason he wanted that money was so that he could set up the families of all his men. And so making sure that whatever the motivation is, it's not that surface level, right? It's not just this bad guy who's maybe intrigued by murder or curious about what murder might feel like. What is behind that, right? If you've seen the Jeffrey Dahmer series thing on Netflix, you learn it was his father who sparked that interest in taxidermy. And his father, at a very early age, leaves the family, right? And so maybe there's a motivation there to reconnect emotionally or feel like he has a connection with his father who's no longer there, right? If a woman has a very abusive relationship with her father or vice versa, a male has one with his father, his mother, they're going to seek relationships where they're put down a little bit, where they're not necessarily equal. So these motivations are everywhere in our lives. And so they should definitely be in the lives of your characters. And one thing I think is important is using those factors over typical psychological factors. One of the things that drives me really crazy is if I see a character who's maybe bipolar, or they have schizophrenic or schizoaffective disorders, or even disorders or situations where maybe they have a split personality or something, right? So those disorders aren't going to lead people to do things that are evil. And they're certainly not things that the person isn't going to remember, right? I don't remember the author, but I know I read a book where they go through the whole story, and the big reveal is that they discover that they've been doing these things all along, right? That would be an incredibly rare situation that makes the story ultimately unbelievable and takes you away from it. So having other motivating factors, right? That maybe this person knew the whole time that they were doing these things, and the deception was because they didn't want the world to see them as this villain because their mother or their aunt or a teacher that they looked up to told them that they were never going to amount to anything and they were this terrible person. And by hiding this, maybe they can convince themselves that this isn't true. So it should never be that surface level or that kind of out of the blue thing, right? That takes away from the connection you've built with a character. Because part of what's going to help you build that connection are these lived experiences that we can all relate to. We've all got family. We've all had friends and colleagues and coworkers and people that we can draw from as far as things that they've been through, patterns that maybe we notice in our own work life, right? If maybe people are always coming to us and asking us for help, what is it about us that draws that? Because more than likely, maybe we're that same person in the family where our family members come and they're always asking us for help. So what is it about us that kind of draws that attention or puts us in that role time and time again. Conversely, if you're completely different roles in different parts of your lives, what's behind that? How do you fit into these different places and create this different person almost in different settings? And in systemic therapy, a lot of times we see what the patient or most people would see as the problem, we actually see it as a symptom. So if you look at addiction in a character or depression in a character, that isn't the problem. Just like it wouldn't be the problem with a client, it's a symptom of a bigger problem. So when I worked in addiction, something I noticed 100% of the time, everybody who is in addiction treatment has trauma in their past. So the addiction isn't the problem. The problem is that trauma that's unresolved. The addiction has become the kind of attempted solution. That's what they're using to try to hide this trauma, to heal from this trauma. Same thing with depression, right? You go through so much and you can only carry so much before something breaks and you get in that depressed mood, or you get really anxious because you don't want to experience those things again. They're trauma responses. And so keeping that in mind with your characters, right? If they drink too much or they're in drugs or they're having depression, it's not just that they're depressed or that they drink too much. What is the root cause of that? What happened to them that they felt this was the answer, or this was something that was going to help me, right? Because that essentially that's the thing that starts it, is how is this going to help me? It's going to numb me. It's going to help me connect with other people at parties, engage more because I'm shy. Again, nobody does something for no reason. So they might not recognize that this is the reason, but there's a reason underneath the action, right? Or maybe they're already high strung and they grew up, and every day when dad got home from work, he would pop a beer and that was how he relaxed. He would go to a party and he would have a beer and he would get more relaxed. And so as a child, start to associate, okay, drinking is how you relax. That's how you unwind and calm down. And then that's the motivation. I need this to help me relax and come back to zero, basically. Another thing to consider that I've touched on a little bit is that the villain will never ever see themselves as the villain, right? Because like I said, they see what they're doing as the right thing to do, one reason or another, whether that motivation is for them or it's to save somebody else, even if that is them, restoring balance and justice in the world, or to get retribution on somebody that maybe they can't, right? If mom was super abusive, maybe the villain is out attacking women because he can't get retribution on mom because mom's gone. And you can almost use that as an advantage, because you know who the villain is, the reader doesn't. And so if you can create a character who wholeheartedly believes that they're in the right, whether what they're doing is right or not, you can almost trick the reader into believing this person is the good guy in the story, and that the true good guy is the villain because they're after them. They're trying to stop them from bringing balance into the world or righting some terrible wrong. And then the big reveal is, no, my way of righting the wrong is trying to hurt people or rob a bank or whatever it is. Finding ways to make that unique relationship and balance between the characters and their motivations play out in a different way. Going back to the family structure, we all play a role in family structure and balance and dynamics. Nobody can escape it. And like I said before, a lot of those roles that we play come out in other areas of our lives. When you're in a family system, you have a very clear job. You can use that to help promote your character's self-perception and their relationships. There was an early founder of family therapy named Murray Bowen, and that's the gold standard that we use in family therapy. Some of the roles you might recognize in yourself. And so as I go through these, if you recognize it in yourself and you feel comfortable, raise your hand, because I'm always curious to see where people fall. So first is the caretaker, the rescuer. This person always puts other people first. Oftentimes it's at their own expense. And they may even struggle a lot of times with setting boundaries. And a lot of times this is going to be your protagonist. Okay. So then you have the black sheep or the rebel of the family. Person often acts out because they feel like they're misunderstood or they've been alienated. They might even reject their family values to a point where they're rejecting all the traditions and everything. A lot of times this is going to be the antagonist in the story.
I'm the oldest, so like right now I'm taking care of my son, taking care of her, but not in her eyes, but in my eyes, I check on her all the time. I'm the only child in the same city with her, but at the same time, I'm the oldest, so I broke all the rules.
Yep. And then you might fall into like the golden child, which is you're the one who holds the family's expectations. I often feel a lot of pressure to succeed or please others. And this often falls with either one. It could be the antagonist or protagonist. And then there's the scapegoat. I notice a lot of people who come through therapy feel this is their role, but a lot of times, not always. Generally, this is going to be like a middle child, but it changes by family. But they're the one who's blamed for all the problems, a lot of internalization, guilt, and they're very defiant. Again, this could be either protagonist or antagonist. And then there's the lost child, who's the one who's very withdrawn, often overlooked, struggle with self-worth, don't always recognize what their identity is, spend a lot of time trying to discover what their identity is. Oftentimes, again, the antagonist. So another thing to look at with family roles is dysfunction versus functional systems. And this plays out through how rigid and flexible those roles are going to be. So a dysfunctional system is very rigid. So this means that all the individuals are really stuck in some sort of pattern of behavior. And that comes from all the unspoken rules that they have. Not a whole lot of room for personal growth. It prevents that healthy communication that we look for, kind of reinforces the dysfunction in the family. And so then in a functional family, obviously the roles are going to be flexible. It allows for the family to adapt, individuals to grow and become their own person within that system. Members can take on different responsibilities based on the circumstances. So an example of that, like the extreme example of that would be, say, both parents are working, but one partner brings in, say, 85% of the income. That partner falls ill and can't work. So while one partner was a primary caregiver and the other partner was more just helping out, that role is now flipped. So in a flexible family, there's no animosity there. There's no resentment. They know it's something that has to be done, and so they take care of it. Whereas if the roles are really rigid, the partner who has to pick up the slack is going to feel resentment, and the partner who falls behind is going to feel resentment because now they feel like they're not contributing or doing their part. Flexible families, they have different responsibilities based on those circumstances, and they can communicate openly about that because they're always working toward a shared goal. Whatever that goal is, it's shared amongst the family rather than more individual. They're allowed to express themselves. Conflict is very constructive. It's not constantly yelling and fighting and door slamming and all of that. Responsibilities are shared across the board because that personal identity overall is valued over these rigid expectations of how to function in this system. So an example of that for a story might be that a detective from a family that's highly enmeshed, and when we say enmeshment, that's the family is too close to a point where you can't really differentiate one person from another, right? There's no clear boundary set. And so this detective would be struggling with their independence. They do things to make others, most likely family, proud of them, to prove their value and their worth. Friends and family constantly asking them to fix things. So using Bloodthorn as an example, my main character unconsciously struggles with his hero role. He had to be the hero for his mother when his father left. He's continued that in his life because he became a therapist, and his whole goal is to help people and solve their problems. And so when his client goes missing, he breaks most, if not all, of his ethical codes to go beyond what his scope and responsibility as a therapist is, because he believes he has a calling to save her, because he had to play that role his whole life. And so this is a way of him continuing this pattern. And then as the story unfolds, you learn that the primary motivation isn't necessarily just to save her. There's an aspect of him that this whole mission or this whole situation is a way to save himself. And it's not obvious to him until he starts questioning his own motives. And why am I willing to throw everything away for this one client? Why am I doing all of these things? And as he does that internal search, he starts noticing those things. Other things that are important, I think, for character development, sticking with Bowen's theories, is the differentiation of self. And that's how either independent or reactive a character is in a relationship. So a character who's independent, right? If they're in a relationship, their partner could be pissed off and they're fine, right? They can be supportive, they can help them, but ultimately it's not going to ruin their day. Same thing if they're having a bad day and their partner is super happy and giddy, like they're going to be able to sit in their feelings. Whereas if there's not a lot of differentiation, then the people in their life are going to dictate their emotion. So if their boss yells at them, if their parent yells at them, if a partner yells at them, their whole day is then ruined. Right? They're going to sulk, they're going to get upset, they're going to be stuck in that. And then you have triangles, which is when you draw a third person into a relationship. A character might be struggling with something, right? If it's a cop, maybe struggling with their partner. So then they bring in the captain or they bring in somebody else. So an example from my upcoming novel, The Consultant, which is being edited right now, the consultant, Raymond Cross, is in conflict with one of the main detectives, Clay. Super heavy conflict through most of the book. And the reason is Raymond feels slighted because the detective pursued Ray in the murder of his wife, and it almost allowed the killer to go free. And then Clay feels that Raymond makes a mockery of police work and investigation, and he doesn't take the field seriously. Clay's partner, Jane, is that triangle. She's the one who dissipates this tension. As long as she's around, they can coexist, they can work together, they might have some banter, but it's not going to come to blows. Whereas if that third person isn't there to dissipate a lot of that tension, things can erupt. It can become a real problem. Married couples who bring their children into their conflicts is another great example of that. Then you have the multi-generational transmission where we play out trauma from multiple generations before, right? Something happened to grandma, then mom passed it on, and then we eventually pass it on to our kids. And that could be repeated behaviors or traumas. A lot of things are abuse. If our parents were abused, we are often abused, and goes down the line. Victimhood, the careers we choose, right? They all fall into that same category. So a character might struggle with getting into or out of even a generational pattern that they don't find as helpful anymore. It's no longer serving a purpose. Or they might struggle with the fact that they didn't. So if a family is a whole lineage of police officers and this character decides to go become a lawyer or something, that could be an example. Or a character becoming a police officer with the sole purpose of solving this cold case that their father couldn't solve and drove his father mad. And so it took him away from his family. This pattern and this history there is what's driving the character. The villain might use it. His, I don't know, his parents or something were attacked, and so now he's wreaking havoc against the police because maybe they were wrongfully killed in a police shooting. Batman is a great example of that, right? His whole existence is based on the fact that his parents were murdered. That's what sparked him, and that's the drive, right? Is that multiple generational trauma. But on the other hand, his generational wealth is another factor. That's what allows him to even be Batman in the first place, rather than some random vigilante who's just out there fighting people, right? And so that plays out twofold for him. It's a benefit and a curse. Another thing to consider with characters to add depth would be an emotional cutoff. This adds a layer of conflict between family members. They might be physically connected a little bit at times, but emotionally they're cut off there. And the motivation behind that a lot of times is that people believe that if they're able to create enough distance, that distance is going to somehow resolve the issues. But one thing we used to always say when we did addiction treatment, when we ran groups, was wherever you go, there you are. It doesn't matter how much distance you create, those problems are following you wherever you are. You can move to a new city, but you're going to attract the same attention, get in with the same group of people. You're going to need the same release because those traumas are still there. So whether it's past traumas in a relationship or something that they want to start over from, no matter what it is, it's always going to be there, following and waiting. And so that has to be true for the characters as well. The traumas that they've gone through, the conflicts, right? They're always something that either they've learned from, they're trying to escape, or they're trying to right even, right? If they had a bad argument with the one who got away, then maybe they're spending time trying to right that wrong and either repair that relationship or find somebody else who they feel is just as suitable. And so those conflicts are always present and should be taken note of, right, throughout the story, even if it's just hints. So like a character who might hate dogs because it reminds them of the dog that they had that ran away when they were a child, right? Or certain types of people, certain characteristics might trigger them, and it could be very random, seen without warning, because it's an unconscious reminder of somebody else, right? Their mannerism might remind them of their dad or their mom or somebody they had conflict with, a brother. And so like in therapy, we call those trigger clients. If we have clients that remind us of people and we struggle with that, those are our trigger clients, because it allows the past to really take hold and play a bigger role in the present than it should. And so I think with the characters though, you don't necessarily always have to hit the root cause, right? Let the reader kind of figure that out. You can hint at it to build the depth, build the relatability, make the readers find a connection, but leave enough room that the reader can almost insert themselves in there, right? Because I would venture to guess nobody is going to read one of your books that hasn't had some sort of family issue, right? Whether it's with a cousin, a parent, a sibling, like everybody fights with family. Everybody has had an argument in a relationship, right? So they can insert their own stuff into that character if you leave it open enough, but not so wide open that then there's no way for them to really connect, if that makes sense. Use it to add the depth, make them relatable, create a whole life of this person and experiences that they've had throughout their existence with just enough gap that the reader can be like, okay, maybe this is what they went through because I feel that, and this is what I felt. And that's going to draw the reader in. It's going to make them want to read more and more of your work. Because ultimately, the plot can be phenomenal, right? But if it doesn't have that human connection piece to it, that's a major factor in whether the person feels like they walked away with something and feels like it's a book that really meant something to them. As good as the plot is and the characters are, if it doesn't have that human element that they can relate to, it's really hard to walk away from that and feel heard, right? Because then that adds a layer of connection between you and the reader as well, right? They feel like, oh my gosh, this author has touched me, and it's like they were speaking to me. And that can be done even in a mystery novel or a crime fiction novel, right? It doesn't have to be a classic literature or anything like that, because at the end of the day, characters are characters, and they're real people in our worlds that we've created, right? And just like anybody else, they've lived lives. Their whole life might not be on paper, but they've lived them. And so that should be very present in everything that you do when you're creating these characters and bringing them to life. And so when you're doing that, think of all the conflict that they might have had, how they've handled it. And like I said earlier, blurring that line between good and evil to where you know who the good guy and bad guy is, but even the bad guy believes that they're right. So I'm going to ruin my own ending for Bloodthorn because it plays into that, right? Where the villain in my book, their brother, who's also a character in the novel that you get to know and you connect with on some level, betrayed him, right? And there was a history of abuse from the father. And so that drives and motivates the villain in the book. And when the big reveal comes, his whole reason, his whole rationale is basically that he felt as hurt by his brother as he did his dad when his dad was abusing him. And so that's the connection between that generational trauma, those family dynamics and roles, right? And then that character essentially deciding, I'm not going to play this role anymore. I'm not going to be the one who is always abused and always taken advantage of. I'm going to take control of my life and make things different. So, yes, he's the bad guy. Yes, he commits murder in the book, but to him, that makes sense, right? And he's almost trying to say, and so there's a human aspect to him where we've all done things, right, to try to make ourselves feel better or to help ourselves, obviously not hopefully to that extreme, but we've said something or presented ourselves in a way that wasn't 100% accurate to try to change the way we were perceived. And so using that in your work to add that depth, the relatability, and a little bit of humanity to the villain, right? Because at the end of the day, they are human. They're motivated. It's just misguided, and they do things the wrong way, obviously, but they're motivated for change, and they're motivated to try to make things better. So I know that was a whole lot of information. So if you want, and if there's time, I would like for you guys to try an exercise where you each write a character sketch based off of a family role, whether it's write a character sketch using a family role of some sort that I mentioned, and then utilizing either triangles or how they're trying to find balance and that sense of normalcy within that situation. And I can remind you of the role. So, Shelley, suggestions for how to choose underlining motivations for characters. I think it depends on what the story is and what it is that they're trying to achieve is the short answer to that, right? So in Bloodthorn, my character, his motivation was one, to break out of a cycle where he was always the target, always the victim. And so the abuse that he had from his family was the underlying motivation. And everything he did in his life, if you read the book and know who the villain is, you see that everything he does from that point on is to change that perception. In my book, I've Been Waiting, the very first scene, the main character, Mari, is attacked in the woods. And it's obviously a moment where she feels completely helpless. She believes she's going to die there. And she feels like there's nothing she can do to really escape. Fortunately, she does. And again, her whole life is spent to never have to relive that. So she becomes a cop, and then she goes into being a detective, and then eventually private security. So not only does she now have the training and the skills to defend herself, but she knows she has a whole team of people at the helm ready to help her until she, in the book, is in a situation where she has to rely on herself. But that underlying cause can be anything. And it's not always necessarily at a very young age, right? Like, these traumas don't have to happen in the first few years of life. It could be at any moment where something big enough that stirs you to your core happens. Losing a family member could be that. Like I said, I think one of the examples I used was a character who is out to get a detective and makes them suffer because maybe when that detective was a street cop, they accidentally shot and killed this person's relative or wife or somebody. Or the person has had bad experiences with cops. And so they've grown up in an environment like inner city, for example, where it's quite normal to not trust the police. You can use anything from their environment to a lived experience, because it could also be that, right? They grew up with a father who told them the government was out to get them and the system was broken and it was all these things. And so now he's out to prove that point or to take advantage of the broken system, right? And so his whole life he's grown up hearing this, and that's his motivation. And I think the more creative you get with it, the better it's going to be, whether it's the repeated messaging that they're getting, whether it's one huge traumatic event or a series of events that drives this person to do what they're doing. I think the underlying motivation is always there if you're looking at it from that systemic perspective of where they live, that biopsychosocial perspective, family history, right? Like there's no shortage of underlining. Just heard the term shard of glass to describe a wound that results in a character's misbelief or a lie they believe about themselves, others, the world. No, I don't usually choose that before I start writing. I write from the perspective of getting to know my characters as they develop. So I've heard of the shard of glass. We usually refer to it as, or what I did was the ripple effect, right? Where if you drop a pebble into water, you have that initial thing that happens, but then there's always things that are going to happen after that as a consequence, right? And so if in the heat of the moment, your dad tells you that he hates you, or your mother tells you that she hates you, there's going to be a lot of ripple effects that come from that. Now you're going to start eventually seeking connection with people that maybe remind you of one of them. You're going to seek validation from people outside of your family, right? And everything you do is going to be seeking that. So similar to the shard of glass, right? Where once it's in you, it only gets worse until you remove it and deal with it. And so those core beliefs, right? If you hear your parents tell you that they hate you, there's a lot of core beliefs that come along with that, other than my parents hated me, right? It's I'm unlovable. Nothing I ever do will be good enough. I'm not valued. I'm not worthy. So it creates a laundry list of beliefs for this person. And when a person starts a belief, they intentionally, whether consciously or not, seek out ways to validate and prove that belief. right? So maybe they get a C on a test. Oh yeah, I'm stupid, I'm an idiot, I'm not good enough, I can't get things right. They ask somebody out on a date and they're rejected. Oh yeah, I'm not worth giving the time of day, right? And so everything is building up to validate this kind of belief that has been created on this one phrase, but there's multiple beliefs there, right? They're not loved, they're not valued, all of these things. So using those, and you can choose one of those as the primary motivator, right? Is it that they're not loved that hurts the most, or that they're not worth anything? They feel like they have no value, or is it the fact that their parents didn't love them? What is it that hurt them the most that drives that? And they're always going to fight that belief as well. So, for example, I had a client who was younger. Their parent, they believe wholeheartedly their parent did not love them, did not like them, did not care about them. And their mantra was, I don't care. It doesn't bother me. But it was very clear that everything that they said and did disproved that, right? They got emotional when they talked about it. They cried when they talked about it. They would get upset when you would ask about the relationship. So they have this core belief that they're hated, they're not loved, they're not wanted. And so then comes the defense. I don't care, I'm going to build this wall, all of this and that. But at the end of the day, it's still something that's deeply impactful. And so even in your character, whatever they do to try to combat that, whether it's addiction, it's that kind of building a wall, it's the depression, whatever it is that they use, whatever the symptom is, essentially, there has to be conflict there, something to disprove it or discredit it to some degree.
Two things. I wanted to make a comment, and that is, I love what you said about creating the character and the levels and all these hidden motivations and all that, but you don't explain that to the reader. You just have that as an underlying framework for the character, but don't tell the reader. Just let the dude act. Just let him act as the way he does and let the reader get that, because I feel new writers oftentimes feel like they have to tell everything and all that. We don't. That's the magic of it. Great on that. The second thing I wanted to ask was about having someone in the book, could be the hero, could be the villain, going into therapy or reading self-help books or maybe following a guru or something. How do you feel about that, or what would be your suggestions about that?
I think that would be great, because the one thing for sure, like the whole theme is, nobody lives outside of the system, right? And so when you have these books where the hero is, they know all, they're infallible, nothing shakes them, they go through and they pick up on everything and they solve this mystery and they're just perfect, right? It's unrelatable. Nobody lives their life that way. Even detectives, they have a whole team of people helping them solve this crime, right? They have other detectives, they have street cops, they have forensics, they have prosecutors, they have literally a whole team behind this, right? Medical examiners. And so your character, whether they're a cop or they're a nobody or whatever their role is in life, they need a team. And so that might be a therapist, right? They're working through their own stuff because they're not perfect. They have trauma, they have hurt, they have things that they're trying to figure out, maybe associating that with the story. They have a friend who helps along the way, or they read a book and that kind of sparks something. But I think it's a wonderful idea and almost an absolute necessity if you want a believable, relatable character. Have something, or even better, a multiple of things that this character uses to help move the story along and help them figure things out. Because at some point, it might be a good quick read, but again, if we're talking about books that people feel something, right? Not just, oh, that was a good book, I enjoyed that, and then they walk away from it and it's whatever. But if you want a book where somebody really feels something that they got away from that book, or that they got from that book, make the character believable. And living in this vacuum where they know everything and they're perfect isn't that, right? So they definitely need to have some sort of avenue where they're getting help and connection and turning to something or somebody.
So first of all, thank you. It's been very informative. I just have a question. What would be the motivation for a poisoner, specifically a poisoner? So what type of personality would do that? If you can answer something like that.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of factors I would look at there. Number one, who's the victim, right? Because you could play with that, where if they're, say, a spouse or something like that, it could be that they want to watch them go through this suffering. And then if it's somebody that maybe they don't know, it's that they don't want to be anywhere near it. They just want to do the damage and be done. But I would say primarily in real world examples where people poison, a lot of times it's that hero complex, right? They do it so that the person will get sick, so that they can take care of them and nurse them back to health, because they already know what the problem is, right? You just stop giving them the poison, they're going to get better. And so either this person is then going to love them and be thankful and grateful and give them all this attention and owe them maybe the outside world, right? This person's really sick and look at this wonderful spouse or mother or child who is so committed to taking care of this person, but they're willing to basically give up their life to care for this person, like a Stockholm syndrome type of situation. So something similar to that, right? Where their motivation is the praise to their value, to be the hero. And so you can use that. And then if it's, somebody else, right? Maybe it was a situation almost like you could play on Aaron Brockovich, right? Somebody who grows up in an area where the government dropped nuclear waste or some type of trash and poisoned the water system, and this person's family got sick and they feel wronged, and so now they're going out and poisoning water supplies or food supplies or whatever else. So it depends on how much humanity you want the person to have, because again, even though it's terrible and it's wrong and it's very essentially sadistic that they would poison their own family, to them the ends justify the means because they're the savior. They're coming in to save this person and they just want to be loved and valued and all of this and that, even though it's obviously misguided.
So I was really thinking of it more in terms of an intentional, like murder, like I guess you could say a spouse. I actually just saw a true crime, and it was a caregiver, and she poisoned the person she was caring for. And on the surface, it was about money. But I'm sure there's something like, so first of all, like, why does a poisoner use poison? Like, why don't they use a knife or a gun? Is there some kind of psychological reason? Are they trying to hide who they are from society? Would it like shame them? So that's what I was wondering.
So I think that has multiple things. Number one, does this victim remind them of somebody, right? If it reminds them of their mother or their grandmother or somebody who did damage to them, yeah, on the surface it's money, but maybe it's actually more emotionally motivated or psychologically motivated. And then using the poison could be a couple of things. One, maybe they believe it's less traceable. Like they might actually get away with it because they're not going to be able to pick up on it. They're going to think it was just a heart attack or a stroke or whatever else. Whereas obviously a knife is obvious, a gunshot is obvious. And they're also a lot more personal, right? Like you got to get down and dirty if you're using a knife or a gun. Strangulation is super intimate and close. So there's a little bit of a distancing there, right? Like your hands aren't as dirty if you're just throwing a tablet of something or a drop of something into a soup. There's a way to distance yourself. And so maybe that could be part of it too. Okay, yeah, I'm poisoning this person because they remind me of my mom, but I'm not willing to put myself into the trenches and do the dirty stuff. And so there's a part where they can make it okay. Oh yeah, I poisoned them, but it was slow. It was not painful. They didn't know what was happening. So there's a lot more levels of distance that they can create and gives them a little bit more time to make it okay. But I would still have something as far as like the motivation. What happened in their life where this happened, right? Because I assume that they've been in healthcare for a while. Was this a pattern? Is it always the same victim, like same type of victim, like always older women, always older men, people who are paraplegic? Try to dig a little bit further into the root of it. And then you can use that to determine the motivation. Because let's say it was something with their mother where mom was very abusive and this person is a trigger client and reminds them of their mother. Maybe they felt their mother had poisoned them. They didn't get to where they wanted to be in life because of all the negativity that mom put in their head and created this kind of negative self-belief and things like that. So you can always use whatever the root cause is to draw out that motivation for the method, right? Like Rambo, not really a mystery, but in the last one, right, the person that he cares about is murdered. And so he makes the comment that his heart was ripped out. And so at the end of the movie, he does that literally to the villain, right? So the thing that started it, he then played it out in the end for that person, right? His was more emotional versus physical. And so you can use that as the why as well.
Hi, yes. Thank you so much for describing the different motivations and like the backgrounds for the characters, because I do really appreciate that aspect. However, I find myself going down these rabbit holes with the research and really, like you said, like getting into the background. So, how do you find the balance between what we're doing in this workshop of talking about the background of the characters and developing that and doing the research and then actually writing the story itself?
Yeah. So one of the big things that I was taught in grad school and that I used throughout my career was the concept of context over content, right? So content is never ending, right? Oh, I tell him I want him to do the dishes and he never does. And it feels like I'm the one who's always having to take care of the kids. Well, she's always nagging me and she's asked me 150,000 times and all, right? So the content can go on forever and ever and ever. But what's the context there? She feels maybe ignored. She's putting out these requests. He's not listening. He's not doing it. He feels like maybe she doesn't respect that he's capable of doing it because she has to always give him direction and always tell him to do things. So now we can do a lot of work there, right? If we know that she feels disrespected, he feels disrespected, that context is going to give a whole lot more than all the content. And so you can do the same thing. Like the content is whatever it's going to be to make the book work, to make the story work. But the context is what you need to make the character work. And what I mean by that is, so the content might be, using that example of poisoning, but that's the poisoning, that's the content. And the context is that the person felt poisoned by their family, and this person that they're poisoning reminds them of a family member. And you can add more context to that from there. So I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, we don't have any more questions here. Jack, do you have anything you wanted to say before we wind up?
Thank you for allowing me to share some time with you and talk about character development using systems models.
This has been amazing. Give us your website.
Thank you. Thank you. It's jacklawrencewriting.com.
Writing with an ing.
Yep.
jacklawrencewriting.com. Check out Jack's website. I went over there this morning. He's got some really interesting books over there.
Got 3 more coming out this year, hopefully. At least 2.
Three more?
Yep.
Wow. Yeah, well done.